Welcome, welcome. Hi, everyone. We are so excited that you're here and happy that y'all are joining us. It's weird to say this is our last live stream, Chris, in September, and that we're already getting into the holiday season. I don't know how that's happened, but here we are. So welcome. As always, please tell us who you are, where you're joining from, and please make sure to put those answers in the comment section on the right-hand pane of your screen. And of course, if you have questions throughout the live stream or things you want to make sure we cover or discuss, please put them there and we will do our best to either get to them live or of course answer them after. I am so excited for today's live stream and for us to introduce our incredible guests and to spend a lot of time talking about anxiety, talking about OCD and the way it appears with adolescents, with kids, and maybe even also, of course, the way it appears in the classroom or in the school system. Before we hop in, a couple general announcements. As always, this is not intended to replace therapy. This is educational. If you're feeling unsafe or suicidal, please call 911, go to your local emergency room, or now you can call 988 here in the United States. If you're outside of the US, please follow your own emergency resources. It's important to remember that this is really intended to create a safe space where people are going to ask a lot of questions. We're going to be really vulnerable. And so we ask that you're respectful of that and respectful of the way you may respond. Of course, as always, we have upcoming town hall, which will be Tuesday at 7 p.m. Town halls are once a month on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. and community conversations are every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And then, of course, we have our lunch and learns and ask the experts every noon on Wednesday. And the second Wednesday of every month, which is in 2 weeks, is our research roundtable with John Abramowitz and Kyle King. You can always go to iocdf.org/peace of mind to learn more about our upcoming events, upcoming streams. And this is also where we want you to go to submit questions and or content requests. So if you tell us you want to hear about anxiety in the classroom, you want to hear about BDD, this is where we gather that information and then tailor our live streams accordingly. So please make sure you share what you're looking for and what you would like to hear us talk about. So I am so excited to share the screen today with two individuals who are so close, I think, to me, but also to the foundation and have just been incredible allies, both in the OCD field and, of course, to the International OCD Foundation. Both Denise and Susan serve on our board of directors. Susan is the current president of the International Board of Directors, and she's most importantly, her probably most important role is a mom, right? She's a mom of an individual with OCD who also speaks out. Meg's incredible. And Susan is an advocate for individuals with OCD and family members. Susan has particular interest in the pediatric and maternal OCD and the impact it has on families. She also focuses on the autoimmune and inflammatory components of OCD and is the current executive director of the Pandas Physician Network. She loves working with the youngest members of our community and their parents and is especially excited that the IOCDF is launching additional programs for kids and teens, like our online OCD camp, which comes up for kids, I think, in February of this year. And of course, she's the current president. But what I want to highlight, Susan, is that it's not just about the fact that you're an advocate. You're a passionate advocate, and you're somebody who cares so much about disseminating what you've learned through you and your daughter and, of course, your family's journey to hopefully make a difference in the lives of other people. And so I know we are all so grateful and always love learning from you.
Thank you, Liz. That was really nice. Thank you.
Of course. And Denise Egan-Stack has been on the International OCD Foundation Board of Directors since 2007 and on the Scientific and Clinical Advisory Board since 2019. She's been actively involved in expanding IOCDF programming, including developing the curriculum for other annual conferences and anxiety in the classroom. She has been a home-based therapist for people with OCD for over 24 years and was a founding staff member of the McLean OCD Institute in Boston in 1997. She's presented and trained professionals on CBT and ACT for OCD, both nationally and internationally. I want to just highlight a couple things, but Denise and a couple others were founding members, founding clinicians of the OCDI in Boston. This is really important, and I want us to talk about it for a second, Denise, but you have been doing this work from the beginning, and you've been passionate and interested in OCD since the development of the first ever residential program, which you were a part of. And so you have seen OCD on such an intense level, both in the residential from the start, but then also in the work you do today, really helping do this home-based environmental work. And I know you do a lot of condensed treatment, which we'll hear a lot about, but it is clear that your passion and interest lie in making a huge difference. And we are also extremely grateful for that.
Thank you. All OCD all the time. I love it.
Well, if you love it, then you are in the right place, right? That's what I always tell people is that if you work in the OCD field or you're an advocate in the OCD field, you love it and it's your passion, or it's just a job. And if it's just a job, we don't last in this field, right? Because you have to be passionate, because we go all in, because there is so much need. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time. Chris and I are going to ask some questions. We're going to do some interview style. We're going to get into some of experiences, both as a parent and a clinician, around working with kids with anxiety. What do we see? What do we notice? How do we help? I definitely want us to spend a little bit of time from the parent lens of how do you navigate when you're being told certain things from clinicians that you have to change, and that might look different from what you've been doing that you thought was helping, but it may be enabling. So we're going to talk about a lot of that today and just dive in. Chris, why don't I let you start, and you'll throw a couple quick questions and then I'll hop in.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about the topic today because, as we know, people are going back to school, and I think school is already a stressful time. I know for a lot of people, this is the first time they're going back because of homeschooling or COVID. There's a lot of people that weren't there, so people are coming back. And one thing I'm seeing resoundingly, I work with a lot of teens and young adults, is there was a lot of anticipatory anxiety. There's a lot of initial nerves. So maybe we could start there. I'll start with you, Denise, and then Susan, maybe you could jump in on ways that you help specifically Meg. But Denise, as you know, kids are returning back to school, they're having a lot of anxiety, they're having a lot of OCD symptoms. What's a good way that people could kind of start working on it initially so it doesn't build up over the semester and then kind of, get to a bubble to the point that then people are wanting to homeschool or drop out of school? What's something people could do now that school's back?
Yeah, good question. I just want to point out that working with kids at any age, we're always also working with parents. Parents are just intimately involved. And I just want to say that from the outset. And so what I'm doing is, prior to school starting, but even now at the beginning of school, is talking about what are the ways in which your anxiety is manifesting, talking about strategies for how to manage that. What are the ways in which it's impacting school? And then how do we pull school into that? So if you don't, a lot of times parents are reluctant to talk to the schools, or I don't want my kid to be stigmatized. I don't know if they're going to be treated differently. I don't want it on their permanent record. But in practice, I've never really had a negative experience pulling the school in. And I think that it's really important to talk to your students' teachers to help contextualize what might be going on for them. Because if an anxious student is in school, they might look like they don't care. They might look like a kid who's causing disruptive behavior. They might look like they have ADHD. And so if you can go in and speak with the school and help contextualize behavior and talk to the school about how they can be helpful, I think that is really getting that done right at the very beginning, I think is great. And then also making sure you're utilizing the tools that you have at school, like the 504 plan, which does not really require testing. You can sort of ask for that, set that up. It's a right that kids have in the school system, and get that set up ASAP. That will help the student have some accommodations that just help them sort of manage becoming, learning and being educated while working on the anxiety symptoms. But it is difficult for kids to do both, to attend and focus all day long at school and manage their anxiety symptoms. It is exhausting. So also sort of just having empathy for that and making space for that within the family. How do you help your child recover? What ways can you help them at home that are not enabling them? So I think those are the things that are on my radar now with the kids that I'm working with.
So I want to hop in for a second because I want to channel a couple things that have come up for me lately. Is I've been doing a lot of talks in the schools. Chris, I know you did one yesterday, and there's just a lot of excitement around. I'm really seeing, for the first time in my life, I feel like stigma reduction is happening, right? People are talking about mental health more. It doesn't mean we still don't have a long way to go, right? I get that. But one of the questions I get, Denise, time and time again is, how do I know if my kid needs therapy? And my response is pretty simple. If you're asking, they probably do. And I always tell people that I've never once had someone say, wow, we sought treatment too early, right? But I hear every day, I wish we would have come earlier. I wish we would have been more preventative in this. But one of the things I know I see as a clinician, I'm sure you see something similar, is this kind of we know anxiety is there, we know it exists, but like it's a little bit better right now, so we don't need to approach it. And so we see like our census goes down in summer, and even at the beginning of the school year, it's not bad yet, and we wait until it's more alarming. There was this amazing mental health campaign that I love to quote that it was focused for Mental Health America on, it was called Before Stage 4. And we talked about how for cancer, we would never wait if we knew we had cancer to be at stage 4 to seek treatment. But with mental health, we often wait until we're in crisis. We wait until we're school refusing. The kids are really, really struggling. It's really severe versus being proactive. Can you talk a little bit about that as a clinician of like what it would look like to be proactive? When should you start even thinking about seeking treatment versus waiting until it's really impacting their ability to function?
Sure. I mean, I am a proponent also of like not waiting till stage 4. I feel like this is primary care, right? If you have a child that is exhibiting anxiety symptoms, like maybe crying when they're getting dropped off, or like late procrastinating with any of their work, their social relationships have seemed to drop off. They don't want to go to school. They're making up excuses for not having to go to school. They are exhibiting more physiological symptoms like upset stomach, headaches. I would absolutely get that in place, because sometimes it's hard to find a treater. Sometimes even if you find a treater, it takes a few weeks to get that set up. But what we know about anxiety is that it can grow quickly at any given time. So what might be like, we're managing, could become a stage 3 or 4 within a matter of weeks, quite honestly. Yeah. And so we always want to sort of get ahead of it, because you can be teaching skills when the anxiety level is a little bit lower. That will become, it's easier to learn when your anxiety level is lower, right? Like if your brain is on fire, it's really hard to learn. You're putting out fires, you're doing damage control. There's not a lot of teaching that's happening in those moments. And so if you get your child into a treater early, when they're exhibiting some symptoms, but they're not really stage 3 or 4, they will learn the skills that they are going to need when they are stage 3 or 4, or we might prevent it from getting to stage 3 or 4. If medication is going to be a part of the treatment plan, those discussions can happen proactively. And oftentimes it takes a little while for a kid to get to the therapeutic dose. And so you don't really want to be starting medicine at a stage 3 or 4, because we're going to have to be waiting weeks for that to be getting into play. So if there is any change in the baseline level of your student's or child's, like ability to engage in school, socially, physiologically, I would start to put those wheels in motion. And honestly, there are some kids that I see, and it's like, if they're doing okay, we can space out to every couple of weeks with the ability to ramp back up when the time calls for it. So there's flexibility within a treatment. It's not like I ever sit on a call or an appointment with a kid where there's nothing to talk about.
Right.
But it might be that we're like, okay, let's go 2 weeks in between these sessions, but we need to have the whole thing set up in place so that we can really put it into practice when time is called for it. And also with regards to school, sometimes it takes a few weeks to get those appointments, those meetings all put together with all of the students. So earlier, better. I have 2 out of my 3 children have anxiety, and I got things started early, and the teachers were always like, wow, you're like early on this. And I'm like, yeah, because this is my job. I know what I need to do. And this is what I recommend to all of the families I work with. Get in early.
Yeah, get in early. And the second piece I love is that it's important to recognize that if you're with a good clinician, it is our job to be honest about needs, right? I've seen cases and done consultations where I've said, like, I don't know that they need treatment yet, right? But here's some things to look out for. Y'all are being like, here's some ways that you can work on it at home. If this starts to increase, like, it shouldn't be that we're just going to see your kid if we don't need to, right? As Denise saying, we'll stack it out. We'll do it differently. But Susan, I want you to share, if you're willing to hear your perspective as a mom of like, what are some of the struggles as a parent that you face when you're faced with the dilemma of like, do I seek treatment? Where do I seek treatment? How do I find treatment? How do I work with the schools, right? Like, I would love for all of us to pretend that there's no stigma ever, but it does still exist. And how, as a parent, do you navigate that balance of getting them help and then also, dealing with stigma that exists in this as a parent?
I mean, it's complicated, right? It's hard to parent It's hard to be a child with OCD or anxiety, and I think it's very challenging to parent. It requires that you learn different parenting skills that we don't all come into it with. I often joke that I wanted to be the mom that, like, when someone fell off the playground, I was always there with the Band-Aid and the love and the kisses and sending him back out. And with a really fairly severe level of anxiety, I had to become a different mom, someone that wasn't reassuring all the time. I think reassurance is like the big one that I talk with parents about all the time, because, you know, it wasn't that Meg was asking one time if she would get sick if she went to school. She was asking 500 times in a day. And so obviously, you know, part of dealing with OCD and anxiety at some point is to slowly learn how not to reassure and to build up the child's tolerance not to receive that, so that they're not, you know, sort of in that vicious cycle of OCD. So that's just one example of how challenging it can be to be a parent, where you're like, wait, I'm not supposed to tell her that she's going to die if she gets a germ at you know, while she's on the kindergarten playground. And I mean, they are all kind of grubby and there are germs everywhere. So am I lying about this? Like, you know, so you really have to wrap your head around whole new things. But then in terms of access to care, you know, in our particular story, it was such a severe onset that we didn't have a lot of choices. And I often say that I think we're lucky in that, because it didn't leave us with that, oh, maybe we're doing okay right now, maybe we're not, because our life was so disrupted that finding help was a top priority. So I always like to be candid about that, because I think there were other times, and I was a great parent during that time frame. Really, I am a crisis parent. Okay, give me a crisis, I'm in. But then there were other times when things had settled down. We'd been through a lot of treatment. We'd gotten some medical help, where I was like, why do I feel annoyed and irritable all of the time? And so that was like my stage 1, stage 2 stuff, where we really hadn't eliminated it, but we were in an easier stage where it was easier for me as a parent to be like, oh, that's her quirks, you know, that's fine. But she wasn't really living her full life. And so the way that I always talk to parents about it is that over time, we developed a culture of courage in our family, in which we took the opportunity to learn all of the time. And the best time to learn were in the 1s and 2s. You know, when I was finding myself irritable, if I was like, okay, I'm irritable because there's more happening here than normal parenting, and I do need to address it. And so in those times, we also like to take the stigma piece and really address it. What we did in our family, and then what we did with her friends, is that we had a culture of courage for everyone, not just for Megan. Everyone is scared of something. So I might have, you know, 2 kids in my house. Let's say a friend is over and the friend doesn't want to order in the restaurant, right? Like, they're afraid to give the order. And you watch this with parents all the time, kids like whispering to mom what they want, and they don't want to speak to the waiter, they don't want to say. And so we would always talk about a culture of courage, and everyone would be given something. You know, if we want to have dessert at this meal, like, all 3 of us are going to do something that seems scary. For me, it might have to be dancing in the restaurant. Okay. So I had a really ridiculous child raising, because that is not the kind of thing I enjoy. But Meg would say to me, Mom, I know you'd be scared to get up and, like, you know, put your hands on the floor and stand there for 3 seconds. And I'd be like, okay, yes, because I know people here, right? I'm gonna look like an idiot. I have a little social anxiety, which I really learned during this process. So each of us would have a task, not just Megan. Megan's might be the hardest, because hers might be involving a level of anxiety that the rest of us were not really experiencing, but all of us would need to do something, whatever it was. And so that was a family culture and a friend culture. And so as a result, it wasn't just Megan who had anxiety, it was everyone that was surrounding her.
Love that. I love the making it a collaborative thing, right? Where it's not just like, oh, you have to do this, and then it feels like a challenge as a parent that, like, I'm just this mean parent. It's like, no, we're all doing things that make us uncomfortable.
Yes.
We're all facing anxiety. We're all facing fear. We're in this together. And, you know, the thing, Chris, I'll let you hop in, is that the thing we talk about across the board is, what is the goal of OCD and anxiety treatment? The goal across the board is that we teach individuals how to change their relationship with anxiety, right? Can you approach your anxiety versus avoid it? Can you approach fear versus avoid it? Can you live freely versus living by your anxiety or OCD, right? That's the goal across the board. And really, there's lessons for parents to learn from the treatment just as much as the kids, right? Or for all of us to learn. Everybody has anxiety and responds to it in different ways, that this treatment can really teach everyone so much. And so I love that. Chris.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say something, and then I think there's a good question. I mean, I even look at like, I would say the last time that OCD really, really hit me bad in schools was my undergrad in college. And it was just rereading perfection. You know, if the professor said, read pages 1 through 8, I read the whole chapter. I was, studying until midnight before test. And what I liked about your conversation, Susan, is I think when we have OCD and anxiety, our goal is how do I eliminate it and get rid of it? But as we know, like even, obviously, even if you get to a place with OCD where symptoms are really reduced, everybody on the planet is going to experience anxiety. And if our whole goal is to always push it away, push it away, push it away, that's a lifelong kind of exhaustion. I think of, I can't think of the Greek mythology right now, but the guy who has to push up the rock and it always comes back down. My Greek family right now is shaming me for not remembering the name. But I think what I finally recognized and what was the breakthrough for the rest of my undergrad and then grad school was I'm going to have anxiety. I'm going to care so much about the grades. I'm going to care about this, but I'm not weak and I'm not, and I have power and I have tools. And when I finally kind of had a shift in the relationship with it, knew that it was going to come, but I get to choose how to respond to it, it wasn't as scary. So just really like the conversation that you had, Liz and Susan, kind of resonate. I'd love to jump to a question that I think a lot of people are struggling with in school. So it comes, Skyla, at 12:05 your time from Captain Cass on YouTube. How can you differentiate general anxiety like anxiety revolving around school versus OCD behaviors and compulsions around school? So I get this a lot from parents. Is it that my kid has generalized anxiety? Is it OCD? How can they tell the difference? So I'll open it up to the panel.
I mean, I can answer that. I do want to just underscore something that you just said, changing the nature of our relationship to anxiety. That is what we are trying to do. It is impossible to have no anxiety. It's not even healthy to have no anxiety, right? Like, some anxiety helps us like study for tests or prepare for these types of live streams, right? But when it's a clinical level of anxiety, when it's really high for long periods of time, or it's like sort of constant, that's when we're intervening. But even in the intervention, it is not to, we have to manage expectations, right? And so changing the nature of our relationship to anxiety, we want to drop the struggle. There is a me and there is an anxiety. There is a Denise and there is a thinker. There is a feeler. Like there's the feelings and there's the thoughts. And we have choice about what to do about those thoughts and those feelings. So for anybody out there like listening to this, that's sort of the foundation, right? So generalized anxiety disorder is really about like things that are like tests or quizzes or, my homework load, or when will I see, like friends or something. Like it's the real life things, but people are just worrying excessively over it. Okay. So, like thinking about your homework load is not an OCD obsession. It's generally just like a worry that is in overdrive for kids with generalized anxiety disorder. But when there's OCD at school, it might be like perfectionism, that like it has to be my best work, or I cannot have any mistakes, or it could be contamination. I always use the example of like the chemistry chemicals in high school, or for college. It might be, getting a 100% on every single thing, or like needing to make sure I understand the assignments, going to every single office hours to make sure that I understand everything, like get it right, get it correctly. So it's really to sort of tease out what is underneath it. And with OCD, there's generally an obsession and a compulsion, right? And even if the compulsion is done in your head, like counting, or saying certain words, or picturing a positive image because you've had a negative image, like an evening out, there is generally an obsession and a compulsion. To me, with generalized anxiety, it's generally like the excessive worry, the worry. And I don't view that as it's separate from a compulsion. Does that make sense?
Oh, for sure. And I would add to that one thing that I noticed, because I work with clients with both in school, and the generalized anxiety seems to always make sense in the scenario. So, okay, I have a test coming up. I have to do, speaking in front of the class. And obviously there's a lot more worry around it. I can't sleep the night before. I don't want to go to school, things like that. My clients with OCD, it's constant. So it doesn't matter if there's a test or not. They're worried that they're going to flunk school. They're not going to ever get into a college. They're never going to be able to work. They're going to live, poor and work, no job their whole life. So it doesn't even matter. Like I've had clients in summer that are ruminating about tests in school that hasn't even come yet, where most of the time my clients with worry, I think the average person could relate, but they just recognize like, wow, that person seems very, very upset about something that doesn't seem as big of a deal to the rest of us. So thank you for that. What I'd love to ask you, Susan, is like, how did you as a parent notice like, hey, something is going on with Meg? And then to kind of, kind of go off of the question we just received, like, how did you also know like, hey, this is what she's going through? Because I think a lot of parents, their kids are starting to show signs in school. Teachers are starting to know it. How do we know if it's OCD, generalized anxiety? Like, how did you navigate that whole process?
I always hate to say we got lucky, Chris, but in a way we probably did, because Meg had many types of symptoms, but one of them that she had was contamination. And contamination, I think, is a more, excuse me, recognizable form of OCD than, say, scrupulosity. So I'll just kind of identify both of those, because I think this is like where parents can get confused. If your kid is, has just right OCD and they're turning the light switch on and off, or checking the stove, or trying to see if the door's locked, like you can be like, oh, okay, that's OCD, right? That feels like there's a compulsion. You can see it. With Megan, she was washing her hands until they bled, right? So it wasn't a normal level of hand washing. It was hand washing so much that the school system was calling me saying, hey, we feel like we need to set some rules for Megan around the sink. And I was at home looking at these hands, trying to figure out like creams and how to fix them and taking her to doctors. So that was like super obvious. The part that was not as obvious was scrupulosity, where she was asking me, questions about, well, I think I was mean to a kindergartner. And I was giving her, hey, well, that's not acceptable. But then as time went on and that was dialing up and I started to learn more, I learned that confessing could actually be a form of OCD. And that's where I think it gets tricky between worrying and confessing, in particular with little kids or even with teenagers, and trying to tease that out. And that's where I think you really need a mental health professional. Like, you can't know. And so I always say to parents, okay, if your kid's washing their hands till they bleed and turning the light switches off and having to go home 35 times to check if the door's locked, then it's pretty obvious. Like, I can tell you it's probably OCD and you should see someone for that. If they're saying to me, hey, it's this, and I'm worried that it's a worry, what I usually say back is you need a really good diagnostician to help you tease it out so we can make sure your child's getting the best form of treatment. I don't care whether your child has generalized anxiety disorder or OCD. What I care about personally as a parent, and what I advise you to care about, is your child happy and functioning. If your child is happy and functioning, then you have got 80% of the world solved, right? And we can go from there. If they're not, then we need to get to someone that can identify exactly what's happening. And I saw a lot of questions in the chat about ADD versus OCD, and it does get tricky. It gets super tricky with our kids. And so figuring out what are those pieces, but I didn't care. Like, whatever it was, I was willing to use every tool in the book. So if there were tools that were ADHD tools that we could learn that were helpful to us, we would use those tools. If there were OCD tools that were helpful to us, those were the tools we were going to learn. So as a parent, it really does kind of demand that you open your mind, not to what's wrong with your child, but what will help your child. What are the tools that will move your child forward in being happy and productive? That's it.
Yeah, to go kind of what you said, Susan, going off of Skyla, if you could put Michelle Hoffman's question at 12:18, I think you just answered this really well, Susan. I know for me, as somebody with multiple diagnoses, it does get a little tricky, right? Like when I was learning, like, what is OCD, what is BDD, what is the blend of the two? And I know a lot of my clients struggle. Am I unable to pay attention in class because of OCD? ADD. And I would say that there are some stark differences. I explained to a client, like, if you can't pay attention in class because you're ruminating about something you did earlier, or you're fixated on a future fear, or is it more so that this isn't really your class? You're finding yourself kind of daydreaming, thinking about more interesting things, and there's not really terror behind it. That's more likely the ADD, ADHD. Is it more about movement? You're kind of, fidgety in your seat. But just like you said, I think what happens is, as somebody with it, it kind of becomes like you're bilingual. I know that sounds a little silly, but you start to notice, like, okay, this feels like ADD and ADHD. This feels like OCD. Okay, my therapist said if this comes up, and you start to get tools. And I know as a parent, Michelle, it's probably very difficult to see these different like letters, that your kid's going through. But just like Susan said, if you can get in front of somebody who's trained, who can kind of parse it out, if medication needs to be involved, parse it out. usually those of us with it start to kind of know the difference, and we really start to understand what's going on.
But I do really caution, like, the ADHD meds can sometimes be really the wrong answer for a child with OCD.
Yeah, very.
So, and I think a lot of, and this is just a parent opinion, okay? All of the doctors can call in after this and tell me how wrong I am. But I'm going to tell you, in my particular area, the doctors who focus on executive functioning, ADD, ADHD, do not know anything about OCD. Okay. My child was misdiagnosed more times than I can tell you in the space of 6 months. I think we went to 12 different kinds of doctors before we finally got a diagnosis. And then even then, no one wanted to treat her. It took us a long battle to get there. So I want to be real about that. Things have gotten a lot better since our time, which was like 17 years ago when we started this battle, but it can be challenging. And so I really want to make sure that we've eliminated OCD as the primary before we start trying medications for ADD and ADHD. Those might be the right medications, and there might even be a combination. But at that point, I want a good psychiatrist in hand who understands OCD, who truly understands that. And so my little tiny clue that I always use is just, if you say on the phone, do you use ERP in your practice, which is this exposure and ritual prevention? And they say, what? I just suggest hanging up. Like, there's no need to have a further explanation of that. Like, if they say what when you say ERP, they don't understand the treatment for OCD. And that's where I want to kind of get some clarity there first of understanding that piece and then thinking about ADHD meds.
Yeah, Denise.
Can I weigh in on this topic? So I think that ADHD is oftentimes a comorbid diagnosis with OCD, especially like boys. It's, OCD, ADHD, and tics. But then I just think, we're getting better and better at diagnosing it. Let's put it that way. It is a pretty debilitating disorder. So I do think it is important to be able to determine what is what. Susan said this and it was like, absolutely. Medication is completely different. If your kid is OCD and is taking ADHD medicine, their anxiety is going to be through the roof. It is a stimulant. It's going to add so much energy to them. Whereas if you have ADHD, it helps you attend and focus. And if your kid does have ADHD, you want to seriously consider medication. It is a frontline treatment for ADHD that helps the school day be bearable for them. So I think it's important for medication. I think it's also important for accommodations. If your kid has ADHD, there are accommodations that they should be having at school that, again, makes it doable for them versus OCD. The accommodations are going to be very different. Sometimes it is hard to tease out. Diagnostically, I can do that because it's ended up becoming one of my specialties because there's so many kids with OCD that I treat that have ADHD. But if you're struggling with it, neuropsych testing is a great way to tease that out. Also becomes the foundation for going to the school and asking for the accommodations that you need. I do believe that the executive functioning executive functioning is disturbed in both. It's impaired in both OCD and ADHD. And inevitably, the executive functioning help will be helpful regardless of whether or not it's OCD or ADHD, right? So it's helping with organization and time management and prioritization. But it is really important, I do think, to determine what is what. It can happen through diagnosticians. It can happen through neuropsych testing. And you also want to look at the function of the behavior. Chris kind of mentioned this. Are you having trouble attending and focusing because you're worried that you're going blind from the chemistry chemicals going in your eyes from the last class that you were in? Or does your body just feel like there's an Energizer bunny inside of it? Are you procrastinating getting your work done because you're overwhelmed and you don't know how to prioritize the homework assignments? Or are you avoiding because once you start this writing assignment, it's going to take you forever because of your perfectionism? So the thing underneath it will help determine if it's OCD or ADHD, but clinically, to me, it's incredibly important that we figure out which is which, even if the executive functioning help at the end is going to help no matter what.
And I want to quickly throw in one more question. And obviously, Susan, your role is this right now. And Denise, if you could talk to this. So user on YouTube, CMLB, asked about college students and being a parent of college students. So maybe, Denise, you could touch on this of, now somebody's off at school, that's going to change their experience with anxiety in the classroom. And then Susan, maybe you could weigh in, because this is where you're at now with Meg. It's less about her living in the home and you being able to kind of be mama bear. Now she's off at college. So if you could touch on, as somebody who's been maybe dealing with this or not dealing with it in school, what are some tools that people could do that are accessible to them in college?
Yeah. So I work with a lot of college students, and I have one that just graduated and one that's in college, one with anxiety and OCD. So I can weigh in on both, but I think this speaks to the first question we asked. What do you do now? And I think with college students, you want to get ready early. So every college university has a students of disability services. It's called different things at different universities, but you want to make sure you have your testing, and then you can go to the university early if you haven't started now, and look for accommodations. You get accommodations in college just like you do in elementary school, middle school, and high school, and they look the same. If your child had a 504 and IEP, you would use that and submit that to the school. And then there's a sort of a process. Like, you get an accommodations letter that you need to email to your professors at the beginning of every semester so they know what the school has granted you. And then you need to work with your professor to make sure those are realized. But there's always this sort of balance between like hovering and helicopter parenting and supporting. And I feel like the college students are the anxious and depressed college students are really, really struggling. Like at home, if you're a high school student, like your parents get you up in the morning, there's food in the house, they might do your laundry for you, like they receive you when you come home, how was your day? They can kind of get a day-to-day understanding of how things are going. But when you were in college, you do not have your parents with eyes on. And a lot of times the college students are avoiding or procrastinating, and their parents don't really have a good understanding of what's going on for their student when they're so far away. So I think for the parents, it's trying to stay in touch, trying to sort of be like, how's it going? Have you done this or have you done that? Like, can I assist you? Can I help you organize? Making sure that the students know where the office hours are, or the tutoring, or just like communicating with their professors to make sure that their professors understand what's going on. Because in my experience right now, professors are really accommodating and very much understanding. And if you just communicate with them in a timely fashion, they're going to help you with what you need, with extensions or whatnot. So for parents, I know it is tricky, but I don't think that any of what I've suggested is really enabling or helicoptering. It's more just like consulting along the sidelines, checking in, having regular communication. You could even go visit to see what's kind of going on, or they could come home once in a while to see what's going on, making sure that they're continuing to take their meds, that kind of stuff, making sure that they're continuing to go to the dining hall. And don't be afraid to pull your child home if you really feel like they're struggling. I've pulled several kids home in the last year just because they needed to come home and do school remotely to get shored up psychologically, and then sort of sending them back.
Yeah. No, I think this is really important for us to be thinking about, is what does support across the board look like, and where do you intervene and in what level? Because, oftentimes that before stage 4 statement, the kids don't know to ask for help before stage 4, right? And so we need to also be checking in different ways and kind of helping them understand that functioning isn't really our goal, right? It's freedom. And that's a really important thing I always talk a lot about, is that from the outside, when I was really struggling, most people had no idea I was struggling, right? I could white knuckle and make it through and even do fine in my classes, but I'm barely surviving until I literally would fall completely apart. As a parent, you're often that advocate and that liaison in between to kind of navigate. You're struggling, you need help. Let's navigate this before it really disrupts your entire experience. I want to keep hopping through questions, and then I want to make sure we transition back to anxiety in the classroom. So I'll answer a couple questions quickly. If you're finding that your child has some comorbid diagnosis, it sounds like, Michelle, you're wondering if ADD might be at play. They've been getting OCD treatment, but academic performance isn't improving. And then how do you determine the differences? We won't be able to do this on the live stream, but I want you to work with your clinician to do that. And so if you're with a good clinician, you should really be able to bring to them all of these questions and all of these concerns. The thing I would ask is that if someone's been in good OCD treatment for 18 months, are you seeing the OCD really improve? If the OCD is improved and managed, but there's still stuff going on, absolutely you want to try to explore and understand what else could be going on and what else might we need to address. If the OCD isn't improving and it's been 18 months, you may want to get a second opinion or sit down with the clinician to see if you need more intensive work or you need to be doing something different. Captain asked a question at 11:28. If you've been diagnosed with OCD by someone who specializes in it, how can you tell if it's good to get a second opinion to solidify that diagnosis over GAD? This is a really good question, and Chris or Denise, you can take this, but I always tell people that, first of all, let's recognize that OCD and GAD are often very comorbid, right? So often people might have a diagnosis of both and they're dealing with both. The good news is an OCD provider should also be able to treat GAD. A GAD provider, someone who can do some basic CBT GAD work, may or may not be equipped to treat OCD. So again, as Susan mentioned earlier, we want to make sure they have background in ERP, exposure response prevention, and that they really specialize in that treatment intervention. But Chris, when would you say it's good to get a second opinion or important to get a second opinion?
I think I was thinking about it while you're talking is I would say, let's say you've been diagnosed with OCD, you're working with a clinician specializing in OCD, what they're talking about, the psychoeducation makes sense, and you start to work together and ERP is working. I'd say you probably don't need the second opinion. I think sometimes I know this because my OCD was all around health OCD for a long period of time. I needed 18 opinions and they were never good enough, right? And I had this weird thing where I had to go to different cities because I wanted to make sure they didn't talk to each other. It was just this whole weird thing. But what I've noticed is that when a client has been, we're in network with an insurance, and a lot of psychiatrists will misdiagnose somebody with OCD that just has general anxiety. And usually within that first session, when I'm doing the psychoeducation, they just don't relate. They're like, I don't really do rituals. I'm not really kind of like, it's just the language doesn't seem to make sense. And so just like Liz was saying, the good thing is we've all been trained way more so in our academic career on how to treat generalized anxiety than we ever were with OCD. So often what I start to notice is like, oh, this is a kid with social anxiety, or this is a kid with generalized anxiety, and kind of shift gears into treatment and have that conversation. So I would only say to ever get a second opinion if you're working with someone and it just doesn't make sense. And when you alert them to that, instead of them kind of adjusting with you, they're like adamant and they're like, no, this is what you have, you need to do this. Then I would start to say, okay, I'm going to go find a second opinion because this isn't vibing too much with me.
Yeah, because like Chris and Liz and Susan have alluded to, the bottom line with anyone who's trained in treating anxiety disorders, it is an approach versus an avoid treatment. So we just tailor it a little bit if it's OCD versus GAD versus social anxiety versus something else. As long as your provider is talking about how do we change the nature of your relationship to anxiety so that you are, coexisting, living with versus avoiding, organizing your life around avoiding anxiety situations, you're probably in good hands. And like Chris said, sometimes there's a need to know or a need for it to feel a certain way, or there's a reassurance component to getting multiple different opinions, which is just going to slow down the onset of getting good treatment. So maybe sit with it and see, in all the ways that Chris said, whether or not they're flexible and working with you and targeting things. Does it feel like it's good work before you seek out a second opinion?
Yeah. And the big piece is that, right, the bigger gauge, the thing I worry much more about is, are we returning to functioning? Right? Are we finding that we're able to re-engage with things we weren't able to? Are we making decisions that we want to make in our life versus letting our OCD or anxiety or whatever is going on make decisions? And if you're not, and you're feeling like, wow, I don't have the tools to address some of this, certainly reconsider and think things through. So lots of questions on this. Another question that we received that I'll just answer quickly was, can you speak to comorbid OCD, social anxiety, and panic disorder? Absolutely. So Marcia, we will work to make sure, we've done a couple live streams, but to really talk about what treatment looks like when we're treating the whole package. But what I will say is that they are all comorbid, and what they all have in common is the core anxiety. And as Denise and others we've talked about today, is that our goal across the board is, can we change our relationship with anxiety? And we're doing that whether it's for OCD treatment, social anxiety, or panic disorder, right? We're understanding what are the triggers, what are the ways we actually feed the anxiety, we feed the trigger, And can we change that relationship? Can we change the way we respond? Can we have freedom across the board? A really good OCD clinician should be able to treat all three of those. Absolutely. And it's important for you, though, that you become your best provider. Not that you need a provider to tell you what to do, but that you really understand the why, right? Why am I doing these behavioral things they're asking me to do, these exposures? Why am I, right? I want you to be able to explain it. I want you to be able to teach it, because you have to become your best clinician. Lots of different questions around accommodation, and lots of feedback. Thank you, Grace. I love the feedback that, like, absolutely you want to seek that, and it's important to get accommodations when you need it. I will also say, I do want to say my own quick piece about accommodations, because I do have thoughts on this as someone with OCD. Accommodations and homework goals in general should be challenging yet obtainable, right? So an accommodation should not be that we want someone to make exceptions for our OCD or anxiety forever. Instead, it should be, okay, what do I need in this moment? When we're talking about for OCD, not necessarily, I'm not talking about like extended test taking or things like that. But I remember, I'll give an example. When I was in high school, I really struggled to be on time. I would get caught doing contamination rituals, and it would take me hours to get out of the door. I'd wake up at 5, and sometimes I'd make it on time. Sometimes I wouldn't. And I remember my principal sat me down and said, okay, Liz, we need to address this. Like, you're tardy. It's a problem. What do we do? And I want you to work with me. Like, how many tardies do you think you need in a semester? And it was the best thing he could have ever asked me, because it wasn't Mr. Lakin saying to me, oh, we're just going to excuse Liz's tardies, in which all that would have done is given OCD a chance to rule my life, and I would have not had to challenge my OCD. But he put it on me to say, what's reasonable? And it was funny, because I was late every single day. And my response was like, well, if you would give me 3 tardies a semester, that would be great. And he was like, okay, really? You only need 3. Sounds good, Liz. But what's crazy is that I stayed within that realm, because I had to challenge myself. And every morning I was in treatment, of course, so I was working with a provider as well, right? But every morning I had to make the choice of, is it bad enough this morning that it's worth me using one of my tardies, or am I going to fight anxiety and OCD and show up today? And what I can promise you is that those little accommodations that were accommodations but not complete freedom for my illness to run rampant are also part of the reason I function well today. Right? It made me learn that in the real world, in the working world, like, people aren't going to accommodate my OCD. They're still going to expect me to get my job done, to complete my tasks as given. And so we have to learn how to push ourselves, right? It needs to be challenging but obtainable. A homework goal needs to be that. Accommodations, other things, they should all fall in that realm. Because again, when we start talking about parents, a lot of the work we do, as Denise said, every kid you work with, you're also working with the parents. We are teaching you how to support and love, but not accommodate. And that's difficult, right? That's really a hard thing. I've got, everyone here knows, but I've got an 18-month-old and a 3-month-old, and my 18-month-old was starting to have separation anxiety with our nanny. And I found myself being like, just sneak out, like, just leave, just go. And then I was like, what am I doing? I'm an exposure therapist. And like, I'm enabling this behavior, right? Of when she leaves, like, and it was like, no, you have to say bye and tell her you'll be back tomorrow. And like, it's going to be hard, but these are important, right? But my point is that even as someone who does this for a living, it's hard to practice it in your own life. It is so difficult when you see your children in distress to not give in and to hold these lines, especially when you know this one way is going to be less disruptive for all of us tonight. One way is going to be more disruptive. But the more disruption, right, that short-term pain, it's the long-term gain we need to really think about. And again, what are we doing for our relationship with anxiety? Because as Denise said, the goal of treatment, we can't get rid of anxiety. We can't get rid of difficulties. We can't get rid of triggers. We can't get rid of weird situations, social awkwardness. That happens to all of us, right? Instead, we have to learn how to live in it, how to navigate life with it, not try to get rid of it.
With relationship to accommodations with school, like Liz said, time limited, just allow your child to be able to learn. They should be fading over time as your child's OCD get better. Always include the student in those conversations about what accommodations are going to be helpful. They're going to, like Liz, they're going to know what they need, and they'll have more buy-in if they have been involved. But one thing I do want to say is that a lot of kids with perfectionism or just OCD or just anxious kids will not want to accept accommodations. They will say, it is cheating. It is not fair. I'm working with one kid right now that has horrible perfectionism and is like refusing to take the SAT because he has extended time. So that is something that I'm always working with in therapy, and you want to make sure that you're addressing that. I don't ever just take no for an answer from a kid. Like, no, I'm not doing a 504. It becomes a therapeutic issue that we need to work out.
All right, so let's get to the bulk of today, which we now only have 10 minutes for, but that's okay. Let's talk about this incredible resource that's available to families, teachers, and individuals, Anxiety in the Classroom. So Susan, I would love for you to just share a little bit about the vision behind Anxiety in the Classroom, and really, so the vision of why it was created, what it is, but then also who should be using it and who is this resource really for?
I am 100% sure, Liz, that if I tried to give you the vision for this program, I would miss about 30 people who have been passionately involved over 20 years. It's been one of those programs that the IOCDF has wanted to work with for a really long time, is how to get this kind of information about anxiety into the classrooms. Denise has been working incredibly closely with a bunch of members of our staff and team internally to do surveys of schools and figure out what's really needed in the classroom. And what we've developed is a full online resource center. And goodness, the number of people that have contributed to this is pretty impressive. But it's really for both teachers and professionals, it's for parents, and it's for kids. And it both gives you ways to access help, ways to understand the illness or what's happening through anxiety, and also ways to communicate to others, which is probably my favorite part of the website. Of no matter who you are, you can suddenly do a presentation or access resources that will help you communicate to other people about what's going on and make things a little bit easier. It's probably my favorite resource that we have right now is our Anxiety in the Classrooms program.
It's certainly something to be proud
I feel like
of.
I should just throw it to Denise. She's done so much work on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly
baby.
something to be proud of, and it is a labor of love. So Denise, tell us a little bit about everything that's gone into it and who you developed this website for.
So, oh God, I feel like when I was in my mid-20s, I was the president of OCD Massachusetts. And so I'm a clinician. I work with kids. So I work in a lot with schools and parents. And we ran an OCD in the Classroom conference in Massachusetts. And it was very well attended. And we had the bright idea of having a panel of students as a part of that conference, right? It was like the first time that we as clinicians were speaking to educators, but I thought, like, let's have the students, like a bunch of kids that I treated, were a part of a panel that spoke to the teachers, and the teachers felt like this was the most important part of the day. This was just like the most beneficial conference we've been to with relationship to this topic. Fortunately, we had videotaped it in the national IOCDF. Then we called it national. Now it's international. IOCDF used that as a basis of like a kit. It was like a VHS tape with some written materials. And we're like, it's super important, but like, it's just so limited. It was becoming outdated. We got a grant. A generous donor gave us some money to develop the program. And so we decided we were going to make it like, bring it into the modern era. And before we started writing, Susan alluded to this, we decided, like, we know what we think people want, but we really need to figure out, do people really want what we think they want? So which I think is really cool, we sent out surveys. So we wrote the educators portions first, then the parent section second, and then the kids section third. But before writing any section, we surveyed. We wrote out this big, huge survey, and we circulated it. We got 1,000 responses before writing each section. So we were sure that we were writing what people really needed. And the goal was, if you Google anxiety in the classroom or OCD in the classroom, you get material, but it's not quite, it's like kind of thin. We were really looking to make it like this deep, loaded with specifics, loaded with tools, information that's going to help you, like, go talk to your teacher today, go, work with the school system tomorrow. And I think that we have achieved that. And it's a live program in which we are constantly going out, piloting, putting this out into the school systems. Like Chris has done it. I've done it. Susan's done it, like coming back together, collecting information about what we think, and then feeding it back into the continuous development of this resource based on our experience bringing it into the schools and based on the school's feedback after having been gone through one of these trainings. So I like that it's written based on what people like. I like that we've broken it down into 3 sections, and I like that we continuously improve it based on our experience in the schools delivering this information. So we're really proud of it. It is a labor of love. It's been ongoing for many years. And like Susan said, there have been tons of people who've worked on it. Steph Kogan, an IOCDS staff person, has been in it from the very beginning, and she deserves like huge kudos for this too.
100%.
I think so like you were saying, I spoke in a school yesterday, and what I hope with this, and what I hope it's used for is, I was sitting there yesterday, and for me it was like a healing experience because I was struggling in high school bad, like my mental health in general, but OCD, anxiety was just terrible. And the reason I always have believed that if like the nonprofit can get into the school, the foundation is going to be so important, is because, as you all know, what makes OCD so dangerous is if we've done 10, 20, 30, 40 years of rituals, the OCD becomes less of like this anxiety disorder and becomes almost like a lifestyle and identity. And so when somebody catches the OCD early, they don't have these years of avoidances. I've worked with older clients that have said, I never went to college because of OCD, or I dropped out of high school, or I never moved from my hometown because I had fears and stuff, and their whole life is shifted. And so getting treatment early can absolutely prevent that from happening.
Yeah. Yep. And
I just was like, so I'm sorry. I know. Go ahead, Denise. Sorry.
I'm just going to say, I think what we're realizing is we need to make sure we have a part of the program that students can go speak to fellow students, or people with lived experience can go speak to students. Clinicians can go speak to clinicians. Parents can speak to parents. We're just trying to disseminate it down in that real way.
I'm excited for all of those groups to be able to better communicate. But I think the part that like absolutely lights all of us up is the opportunity for, a middle school student who has anxiety to go in and do a presentation to their class, to their school, whatever they may feel comfortable doing, where they have materials, they know that they're speaking kind of from a best practices perspective. There's some assistance to them, so they're not alone in it, but that it's really like, they're like, this is valid information. And then, like we all know it. Every time I talk to a group of 4 people, someone comes up to me later and either says, I have OCD, my friend has severe anxiety, my parent is struggling. Like always within a group of 4, someone comes back to me afterwards. That is so true in every high school and every middle school, but it's hidden. No one's talking about it yet. We're starting to see that stigma reduction, but it's these kinds of presentations that I believe can really let kids start talking about it and therefore find hope, tell their parents about it, tell a teacher about it. If you're not talking, if you're hidden in shame because you think you're the only one, that's the worst place to be, right? We've got to have a starting point. If nobody knows why John's not showing up for school every day and it's tardy every day, and it turns out that they were just like Liz and they were getting up at 5 and trying, but just couldn't get there because of compulsions, that's the worst situation. The minute they hear from, the minute Meg goes and speaks to a large group of girls and talks about what anxiety has been for her, suddenly those other girls are empowered to come and talk about it with her and with others and to start to receive help. And that's the power of the program.
Yeah. And I think it's timely because of post-COVID. I mean, were we ever post-COVID? But you know what I mean? We're back to school. And I think that people have really struggled with their mental health over the last couple of years. And I think the educators are seeing an uptick in things. I think kids are feeling it. I think, parents are feeling it. I think it's timely and it's incredibly necessary.
Yeah, there was a comment about social anxiety, and that's what I heard from a lot of the kids yesterday in regards to like coming back to school. And they were like, I actually loved, virtual school. But it was like, of course, because it was accommodating the social anxiety. You got to be off camera, and stuff like that. And so I think that's a good part of it too, is just the social aspect. I'm working with a client right now struggling because they love school. They talk to classmates, but lunch and having to go up to a group of people and sit and eat lunch is too difficult. And so they're just kind of wandering the campus during lunch, and that's really hurting their self-esteem. So all these different aspects of school being addressed is so important. So I'm so glad the IOCF has put so much time and energy into the resource.
Absolutely. I mean, and I love that the resource, it's easy to follow, easy to navigate. And here's what I'll say. I think a lot of times, I know for myself, I was kicked out of my private school for my OCD, and it was a really difficult time. It was in the 8th grade when I was really struggling, and I felt like I was not just losing myself to OCD, but then I'd kind of lost my friendships and things were disrupted. The reality is the private school didn't really have to make accommodations. And I ended up going to this 4,000 person public school for high school and was just overwhelmed. But here's what I will tell you. I could not believe, and neither could my mom, and she can't to this day, how many of my teachers, she brought them brochures back in the days. This is before we had like easily accessible electronic stuff, right? But she would bring them brochures and a book and like put together a packet, and how many of them read it and asked questions and wanted to know more. And so I think sometimes, I'm just throwing that out there because I think at times we think, oh, our teachers are too busy, or, we don't want to burden them with more information, but they are here to help. And they entered the field because they care, not for money or for other reasons, right? And so it's so awesome to have this resource where in one place we can know they're getting good resources, good information that's the right information and good quality, and that they can disseminate it for themselves, right? Use it at their own disposal. And hopefully they will use it not just for your student, but for other students as well, because they're certainly going to experience lots of different students throughout their career with anxiety. So I know we have to wrap up, and we will always end with kind of saying thank you, but I'll let Denise and Susan just share a couple final words. I'll start first, and then Chris. I just wanted to say thank you. I want to say first and foremost, thank you to the International OCD Foundation for working so hard to make this resource available, because there's just not enough resources out there. And the more we can disseminate good education and good resources, we will start to change stigma, and we'll also start to change access to care, which is at the end of the day, the core of all of our goals and the mission of the IOCDF. So I am so grateful for this conversation, and I love that we can even talk openly about anxiety in the classroom, that you're seeing parents and kids be more willing to do so now than ever before. And I'm, of course, equally, if not more excited that there's an incredible resource available to them. So please be sure you share this resource with anybody that you think will benefit from it. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, yesterday I spoke at a high school, and the staff came out, the counseling staff, all 4 grades of the high school, and I was a little bit, I didn't know how it was going to be received, but the kids laughed when I made jokes, but they were paying attention. A lot of them came up to me after and kind of shared their stories and asked questions. They even did a lunch where some students came, and I was so surprised at how hungry and like attentive these students were, and it's because all of them are dealing with it, or they're dealing with somebody, or they have a friend that's dealing with it. So I'm really just really excited about this program and just wanting to do more of that. I think the more that we can educate families, students, staff earlier, I think the better off. I think Liz and I always say we wish we gotten help a lot sooner. Denise.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you, Chris and Liz, for hosting us. I do want to just underscore one thing, is that this website is a website in which we are constantly making tweaks, and we are open to feedback from anyone who's reading the information or trying to use the information in school. Feed it back to us. And once we start to see patterns and responses, we will be making timely changes to that. Again, like, we survey, we write, and then we revise based on personal experience. So honestly, we very much are interested in what your feedback is, and we will take that very seriously, because our ultimate goal is to make this like an amazing resource for people who are struggling with this problem.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Liz and Chris, thank you for letting us be here today to talk about this. This is definitely a passion project, if you can't tell. We have a lot of energy. We could talk for about 12 hours about this, but if you're listening in today or listening to record in the future, I would say go use a piece of it and then shoot us an email and let us know how it went. We would love to hear your stories. The only way for us to really continue to improve this resource is for people to use it. And we hope you'll take it to your school systems and start using it. Let people know that it's out there. Have your kids use it, enjoy it, and let us know how it goes.
Yeah, that's the point of it, right? To use it and disseminate it, and be sure to tell us if there's other things you want or other needs that arise from it, so that we can keep serving the community in different ways. Thank y'all so much. Thank you for your dedication to the field, and thank you to everyone who joined. Of course, we will see you next week at our Ask the Experts on Wednesday at noon. And of course, our community conversations will be next Tuesday at 7 p.m. See everyone there.
Have a good one. Bye.
Bye, everyone.